Good morning. This is Eric Homeland. I'm filling in for Bethany Garrettson here in this environmental history class. And today we're talking about the American West. And the theme today is the unforgiving West, water, gold, meat, and grass from our Steinberg book. The American West has long occupied a central position in the American imagination, the American psyche. It's one of our most cherished resources, and it really is something that sets us apart from many other countries in Europe because it's so abundant and so large. Now, the chapter focuses on the key resource of water. Water is the most scarce thing in the American West and is the resource that attracts people and wildlife. So it really is the environmental condition that dominated and shaped the settlement of land west of the 98th parallel, which essentially is roughly west of the Mississippi. It both limited settlement, but also enabled tremendous agricultural productivity, which fed the nation. But the issue here is that in the early settling time period in the 1860s, 1840s, there was a period of rain that lasted about 20 years. And this is a long enough period of excessive rain or unusual rain that people became to think it was normal. So the rain charts established at the time, um, uh, it should have gotten less than 20 inches of rain per year, but people misinterpreted the amount of water in that area and settled there anyway. This dearth of rain essentially is insufficient for farming wheat and corn, which are America's staple crops. This is the food that maintains the population centers in the eastern United States. So you can't farm this without irrigation, and irrigation comes from impounded water or water in the water table underneath. So one of the things that I think you need to know about why isn't there rain in the American West, it has to do with a term called orography, or essentially how mountains, natural features like mountains, block the winds from traveling inland from the Pacific Ocean, because it forces the air, the moist air, to ride up the slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and in order to, as it rises, it cools and then sheds its moisture, comes over the Sierra Nevada mountains, and is much drier. So you'll see much more vegetation on the western side of the Sierra Nevada and much less on the eastern side. So there's precipitation, ample precipitation in Northern California, and then desert east. You can see here the clouds form in the mountains, and essentially mountains make weather. Okay, important to know that. All right, so grass is the resource that allowed for the rapid expansion of the American West. Here's the image of Manifest Destiny that you might remember from high school. It is sort of the vision of a lot of Eastern Americans that our destiny is to essentially settle the entire continent that we've got before us, from Manhattan on the far right of the photo or the painting, all the way to the Rocky Mountains and beyond, and the left of the painting. So John Wesley Powell, the chapter mentions, he's a great Western explorer who essentially pioneered the Grand Canyon, the first person down that. He suggested that small farms really were the way to go, not large farms in the West, because there's not enough rain to farm effectively. But in contrast, large ranches for grazing and cattle would be more effective. This idea essentially was ignored, so people had much larger farms than they really could sustain. But that would have been a much more effective way of settling the West. Well, the next thing to think about that really shaped the kind of human history of the American West, but also was an environmental boon here, is the discovery of gold, first in California, then later we're going to talk about Colorado. So the gold rush started in 1848 in California. This sent essentially people searching for fortune from the population centers in the east all the way out to the west. caused a rapid expansion of population in California, which brought with it, you got to feed all these people. So it brought with it an increasing amount of agriculture that was developed in Northern California. And it also pushed out a lot of the population that was there before them, Native Americans and Hispanic populations, essentially. So Native Americans, you might recall from earlier in the semester, were already pretty much devastated by an environmental condition called disease. So European diseases that they were unused to essentially decimated Native American populations. So they were weakened. There were fewer of them, unfortunately. So there was less competition for space for these people from eastern United States to essentially take over. So mining, let's take a look at mining. Mining essentially creates a big mess, essentially, because you've got to dig down either into solid rock, or here you see them digging into alluvial sort of soils. But of course it disrupts everything around it. It disrupts the land cover on top of the ground. It sends all sorts of sediment flowing downstream. It really is a very, very destructive activity to get gold. It creates something called tailings, which are sort of the small rubble left from mining. And then, of course, massive erosion. So the first method that they use, the methods that shows the mountains here. So in the Eocene, about 55 million years ago, there was a tremendous amount of erosion because it was wetter back then. The erosion brought down pieces of the Sierra Nevada mountains into the edge of the mountains through erosion, and of course all of the sediment down there was filled with enough gold that it made it worth mining. So it kind of concentrated the gold there. And gold is heavy, so it settles out into the beds of these streams, and which makes it comparatively easy picking for the miners. So it makes it much more efficient. So this is why the gold is there, and it's been there for many, many millions of years. The Sierra Nevada rose, which concentrated the runoff in certain downstream locations. All right, so we just talked about the hydraulic mining. Well, the first method for mining was simply just miners in the reservoirs upstream. The point of this is a massive industrial scale erosive event, and according to your text, it's the greatest erosive event in 600 million years. So this is a force that is greater than nature. Essentially, human activity is greater than natural processes here. The other natural impact of this is it fills downstream tributaries with sediment, which impacts salmon and other fish. They cannot spawn in the cobbled bottoms because the cobbled, rocky bottoms of streams are now choked with mud and sediment. So it really does have a sort of an echoing and amplifying environmental effect. Okay, so this led to some policy changes regarding who owns water. First, water was a common resource, and you could own the surface of the land, but anybody had access to water and sort of rock underneath the land that you owned. Now this changed because if water and gold were owned, essentially, if you owned everything beneath your property, then you had a greater control over it, and you could buy land and then make millions of dollars because it's your land, and you could keep other people off of it. So this changed the laws. Land became a private asset, not only the surface of the land, but below it as well. So then you could invest heavy industry into your piece of land without the fear that somebody else will kind of jump your claim underneath, own some land next door and kind of mine underneath your land. So the laws changed, which allowed even more industry in terms of industrial mining to come back in. All right, so we're going to take a look at grass as the lead-in resource for the settlement. Essentially after mining in 1848 into the 1850s, we had much more activity in terms of pioneer settlement. This image shows, the trains bring people to the edge of civilization, and then the grass stretches into the horizon. You see on the left settlements, sort of buildings, people cutting trees down in order to make log structures. Native Americans sort of watching in sort of shock and awe here as they become pushed out. But essentially the wide open expanses to the west, and essentially the pioneers on the left of the image, you can see them moving into the west to seek their fortunes. So there are two principal routes to get to all this lush grass, and you probably also learned about these routes in your earlier education, public school. But one was the Oregon Trail, and then this slide shows you the Spanish Trail, which headed west initially from Kansas, but then took a turn south, and this was an old Spanish route. So these were the two sort of highways, the interstate highways to get west. Large numbers of settlers. It said there were 300,000 between 1841 and 1859, causing environmental damage concentrated right along those trails. So there were lots of space out there, but all the impact was concentrated on those two trails. But I did the math. And if you divide 300,000 by the number of years between 41 and 59, it's about 16,000 people a year, which to me doesn't sound like much, but that also tells you how fragile the ecosystems were out there for that number of people to actually have a tremendous impact. Probably larger than the human impact was the impact of all these horses. So there were 300,000 people, but many times that, 5 times that in pack animals and horses. And of course, each horse has so much more impact than a human on soil and vegetation. So look at these animals dragging, looks like there's 2 wagons hitched together, a massive team of horses. Most pioneers had fewer, maybe cows or oxen were dragging their wagons, but you can imagine the tremendous impact of these very large animals on the roads. Essentially, they were trails. So these large numbers of people along the trails, they needed firewood to burn for cooking their food, but they also needed wood to build structures, to build their farms, to build their fence rails. And eventually this was a tremendous impact on the few trees that were available out there, because it was mostly grassland. So the trees were cut for fuel. The grass was cropped closely by animals, causing essentially desertification. If you get rid of trees, that dries out the land. And if you eat all the grass, that further dries the land out, mobilizing the soil underneath and leading to more erosion from wind, but also during storm events, the water can wash the topsoil more quickly into tributaries. So it really is not a good cycle. It leads to tremendous drying of the land in a process called desertification. Well, let's take a look at how this affected the Native Americans. This is a painting that my uncle made, who died. Of course, he lives in South Dakota when he was alive, and you can see this image of the Native Americans and the market hunters having conflict over something they both wanted, which was bison or buffalo. So the Native American population centered on the harvest of bison and for food. And then, of course, the market hunters wanted the bison for their hides to send to Eastern U.S. and Europe because these hides were in fashion and they were very warm for clothing. Now, you can see these Native Americans are on horses. These horses were not always in North America. They came with the Spaniards hundreds of years earlier, I think in the 1600s or even the 1500s. But by this time, Native Americans had completely adapted to living a life on horses, which completely allowed them to hunt much more effectively and to kind of roam more freely over the Great Plains and to settle areas farther out into the Great Plains. So it was transportation for them radically changed their lifestyle. You might say in a good way or a bad way. So they were competing for rivers and grass and watering locations with the pioneers. So the pioneers had cattle, had their own horses, and the Native Americans also needed the same water and the same grass. So yet again, additional conflict over resources. Uh, a lot of the watering of livestock and the activity out there in terms of building things and settling was focused again on rivers. So these trees, the few trees that were out there, tended to be clustered in the river corridors, and these few trees then were very valuable for timber, for building structures essentially and fence posts for the American settlers. So these trees, you cut the few trees that are left, and your rivers become even more dry. Okay, so this is a very visible impact and something that was felt by everybody out there. After this period of couple of decades of sort of unusual rain in the American West, this garden out there that seemed to be very, very plentiful with nature and grass and easy to plant crops, then the more normal weather pattern came back, and this was a drought, a pretty excessive drought. So starting in 1849, these waves of drought for 15 or 20 years really, really changed the climate and the landscape out there, made it much more difficult to live out there. So first we had rain, now we've got drought, and how do you adapt? So pretty important that climate, sort of periodic changes of climate obviously affect the landscape, but affect the experience of the humans living on these landscapes very, very dramatically. Well, we're going to shift to Colorado here. I found this map of where the gold is or was in Colorado. To the right of the map, you can see the Missouri River, Nebraska, Missouri, Kansas, and the jumping off cities like St. Joseph, Nebraska, Omaha City, Council Bluffs. So those were the cities along the Missouri. And then you have these trails leading to Colorado and the smaller settlements at that time, Cheyenne, Laramie. And this was before Denver was a big thing. But you can see the Colorado Range to the left of the map, and some gold that was found in the Front Range in Colorado. A similar rush. So this is later, 10 to 15 years later, a second gold rush, and it was closer to the eastern seaboard, so more people came. So this drew even more pioneer prospectors traveling than the previous gold rush. More timber cut, increasing conflict with Native Americans over resources. So we see just all the cycle that we had talked about amplified and repeated. So this conflict with Native Americans really intensified, and they were hungry, they were poor, there was disease there in Native Americans, and of course there was untold wealth for the eastern U.S. White population. This led to conflict and led to violence, and there was some peaceful relations between Native Americans and the white settlers, but eventually the army had to move in, or the U.S. chose to move the army in to push out Native Americans. This is an image of Fort Laramie and in the American West. I think Colorado, and many of these forts were erected as bases for the Indian Wars, essentially, where our military went out and targeted and attacked and killed Native Americans to clear out the Great Plains for eastern U.S. Euro-American settlement. Well, let's take a look at meat and the bison. We've talked about the bison. This was one animal that greatly influenced the environmental and social history of an entire continent. In the 1830s, reportedly, these herds of bison extended all the way to the even western New York State. And this is, no one knows for sure, but Buffalo, New York might have indeed been named after buffalo in western New York. So interesting to think about these great bison herds extending for most of a continent. So lots, I mean, just a tremendous number of these animals, millions and millions of them, tens of millions of them, So you can imagine the size of them, how much protein is there, and fairly easy to hunt with the right strategies and right weapons, and fed entire populations of the native folks. This image shows how, with the advent of horses, hunting became so much easier and effective for Native Americans. They could hunt more, they could go farther, and get these bison, buffalo, and their populations then grew, so that it fed more and more people. Now the idea, was this sustainable? It's a good question. At its peak, there were 27 to 75 million of these animals, depending on the various estimates. And was it were these able to be harvested sustainably? There's some dispute about this. So your text says that the Native Americans killed about 500,000 of these animals per year, which you would think, if there are 20 million, even the low estimate, 500,000 a year isn't going to even dent that. But apparently, there's some evidence that the harvest grew so that it was actually thinning the herd out enough so that the Native Americans had to go farther to get their bison. So there is some evidence that it did have an impact. Now let's shift to commercial bison hunting. And I mentioned before that these hides became bison robes that were very much in style in the eastern U.S. and Europe. So from the 1830s, 1850s, this commercial bison hunting industry grew up in the plains. Tremendous numbers of these hides, tremendous numbers of animals killed, a mountain of bison skulls in this image. You can just imagine how many, probably hundreds of thousands, if not billions, of skulls were in this pile. So this is called market hunting. A new tanning method in 1870 allowed for these bison hides to be more effectively tanned. And to get these heavy hides out, you needed a way to transport them, and that goes back to railroads. So this also made railroads profitable. So more bison hunting, more profitable railroads, more development, more people out there. So essentially, we have the growth of mercantilism and more settlements, more people, more cities, more villages. So this is in the context of the U.S. Army war on bison to actually subdue the Indians. So not only were we killing millions of these bison to make money on them, but we were also killing them to starve the Native Americans out. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy, but that was our strategy, and the U.S. government made this decision. The cattle herds that grew up at this time in terms of ranching, there's a lot of money to be made in ranching. So those cattle herds also competed with bison. The cattle herds were free ranging, also the bison were, so they were in direct competition for grass. All of this spelled the doom of the bison. Bison essentially were killed off in 1882, and there are some left, and they're coming back on some ranches now due to conservation. But they were essentially almost made extinct because of over-exploitation of the resource. All right, we're going to shift to another form of meat. We mentioned cattle. Let's take a look at cattle here, and they became mobile assets or meat on the hoof with direct cash value. You might think of them as walking rolls of $100 bills, and really, really valuable here. They need grass, so grass became cash as well. And the Texas Longhorns were the first cattle introduced, and they spread northward eating this free-range grass, which led to a tragedy of the commons. Grass was everyone's property, so therefore individuals could take advantage of it and overexploit it for individual profit. The entire resource crashes. That's a tragedy of the commons. So this led to, again, this link to railroads. So railroads were needed to ship the cattle to the east. So more money from the cattle, more railroads, again, a cycle of greater and greater investment. And I learned from your text that investors from the United Kingdom invested in this entire industry to provide U.S. beef for European consumption. And this was after they learned how to ship beef overseas without spoiling. Because of this tremendously profitable cattle industry, this led to the development of an invention here of barbed wire. Barbed wire in 1873 also changed the environmental quality of the region by keeping your cattle confined to your own land, which concentrated impact and sort of grazing on your property without except dispersing it over the entire Great Plains, which you would think would protect the Great Plains, but what it did was it made it more profitable for land ownership and having your own cattle controlled and confined. So therefore, more and more people bought more and more land and did the same thing, which affected, of course, animal migration as well. All right, so these defenses themselves, ecological consequences, concentrating the cattle's impact, essentially. I told you a little bit about that. Now, there's a point in your chapter that talks about seasonal changes. So tremendously cold and unusually cold winter of 1886, killing hundreds of thousands of cattle, which essentially put a big damper on the market for beef. So weather can cause tremendous economic impact and cultural impact as well. So many, hundreds and thousands of these cattle killed on the hoof and then rotting in the sun when the spring came around. Okay, next thing to talk about is grass again. So it was hit by another periodic resident of the Great Plains, and these are locusts, a form of grasshopper. Voracious appetite. You might have heard of locust swarms. They're in the Bible. They also are part of the mythology and sort of folklore of the American West. Locust outbreaks and swarms, they come cyclically, every 2 dozen, 3 dozen years, and they can ravage entire crops within weeks or maybe even days. 1874 to 77 were exceptional periods of locust activity. An image here of a swarm of these things, how incredible force of nature insects can be. But yet they're cyclical, so they eat everything and then they fade out, they die. So and then they replace it with their own biomass, all these dead locust bodies. So it's a period of sort of resource depletion, and then it's coming back again as the locusts die. But it's difficult to live through, of course. There's so many locusts on the wing that the biomass of the locusts was incredible. They equaled the largest herd of bison at that time. So can you imagine how much biomass is in these locust explosions? Eventually, though, the Rocky Mountain locusts went extinct because of farming, essentially. Farming reduces the availability of the kinds of soil environments that locusts need to lay their eggs. So the settlement of the West actually reduced the problem of locust plagues, essentially. Eventually, Rocky Mountain locust actually went extinct because farming destroyed its ability to lay eggs. When we said goodbye to the locusts, then it allowed really the West to continue to be expanded and settled. We see here a modern railway providing market penetration and access to the American West. These are several of the most important influences on the environment and the culture and the people and the wildlife and ecology of the American West. Hope this helped you understand the chapter. Okay. On their own or just working with a couple of people, and it was this idea of placer mining or sandbank mining. Essentially, you might think of this as panning for gold. So single operators, just small groups, digging, scooping up sand and then pouring water through it through a sieve and seeing what you would get. So, fairly small amount of environmental damage here, and they got small amounts of gold. When these sort of fertile streams ran out, the corporations moved in with really